The funeral home was silent except for my sister Patty's bitter whisper. She never loved her anyway. My brother Dennis nodded, adding loud enough for everyone to hear. Mom's just here for the inheritance. Dad finally saw through her act. I felt my daughter Ruby's small hand squeeze mine as she looked up at me with those big brown eyes, the same eyes as her grandmother Judith, the woman they were talking about, the woman who'd been dead for 3 years. Even Pastor Thomason shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his Bible clutched tighter than usual. The funeral director, Mr. Holbrook, actually stopped arranging flowers to stare at my siblings in disbelief. Here we were, at our father Gordon Crane's funeral, and instead of mourning him, my brother and sister were attacking the memory of our mother, who wasn't even alive to defend herself. "Can you believe Dad left everything to her and that kid?" Patty continued, not even trying to lower her voice anymore. She gestured at me and Ruby with her manicured nails, her black designer dress pristine and expensive, everything about her screaming money and success. 42 years of marriage, and Mom was playing him the whole time. Thank God he finally saw it before he died. Ruby's hand trembled in mine. This beautiful, brave 8-year-old who'd lost her grandfather just 3 days ago was listening to her aunt tear apart the memory of the grandmother she'd never really gotten to meet. Judith had died when Ruby was only 5, but Gordon had kept her alive through stories, through pictures, through the recipes he'd learned by watching her in the bakery all those years. "Mommy," Ruby whispered, but I squeezed her hand gently, trying to signal her to wait. I wanted to scream at my siblings, wanted to remind them where we were, who we were supposed to be honoring, but I also knew that grief makes people cruel sometimes, especially when money gets involved. Dennis pulled out his phone, probably checking the estimated value of Dad's house again on some real estate app. $300,000 at least, he muttered to Patty. "Split 3 ways, that's enough to finally get out of debt." But no, the manipulator gets it all. That's when Ruby stood up. She reached into the pocket of her little black dress, the one we'd bought together at Target because that's what teachers' salaries afford, and pulled out a sealed envelope. The handwriting on the front was shaky but clear. The truth in our father's distinctive script. "Grandpa Gordon told me to read this today," she announced, her voice carrying across the room with surprising strength. The entire funeral home fell silent. 63 people, all friends and family who'd come to say goodbye to Gordon Crane, retired postal worker and devoted husband, turned to stare at my 8-year-old daughter. Uncle Walter, Dad's older brother, leaned forward in his wheelchair. The cousins from Denver stopped whispering. Even Mrs. Chen, from Dad's postal route, who'd driven 2 hours to be here, put down her tissue to watch. Ruby walked toward the casket with determination, her little Mary Janes clicking against the funeral home's polished floor. She climbed onto the small platform that Mr. Holbrook had placed there for people to pay their final respects and turned to face everyone. The overhead lights caught the tears on her cheeks, but her voice didn't waver. "My grandpa asked me to read this if anyone said mean things about Grandma Judith," she said, looking directly at Patty and Dennis. Patty's face went white. "This is ridiculous," she hissed. "She's 8 years old. Melinda, control your daughter. This is a funeral, not a school play." But Ruby was already opening the envelope, her small fingers careful with the paper inside. She unfolded it slowly, and I could see Dad's handwriting covering both sides of the page. Whatever was in that letter, he'd had a lot to say. "Wait." Dennis stood up, his face flushed with anger. "You're not seriously going to let a child interrupt our father's funeral with some made-up letter? Melinda probably wrote it herself, another manipulation tactic learned from Mom." Pastor Thomason cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should hear what Gordon wanted to say," he suggested gently. "If he gave this child a message, it must have been important to him." Ruby looked at me one more time, and I nodded. Whatever was in that letter, Dad had trusted her with it. And if there was one thing I knew about my father, it was that he never did anything without purpose. "Go ahead, sweetheart," I said. What happened next made my sister collapse to her knees, sobbing in a way I hadn't seen since we were children, and changed everything I thought I knew about my parents' marriage. 3 days before the funeral, I was grading papers at my kitchen table when the call came. Dad was gone, a heart attack in his sleep, peaceful and quick. I'd been expecting it someday. Gordon Crane was 65 with a lifetime of bacon breakfasts and stubborn refusal to see doctors. But nothing prepares you for that final phone call. Mrs. Crane? The voice on the other end was gentle, professional. This is Dr. Morrison at Riverside General. I'm calling about your father, Gordon Crane. The red pen fell from my hand, rolling across the stack of third-grade spelling tests. Ruby was in the living room, practicing her multiplication tables out loud, and I could hear her sweet voice saying, 7 times 8 is 56, as my world shifted forever. After I hung up, I sat there for a moment staring at those spelling tests. One of my students had written love as love, and I'd been about to correct it. Such a small thing, but suddenly it seemed important that this child understood how to spell love properly. Mom would have said the same thing. Words matter, Melinda, she used to tell me when I'd help at her bakery. Whether you're writing a recipe or a love letter, precision shows you care. Ruby had been especially close to her grandfather. Every Sunday after church, while I helped at the community center, she'd spend hours at Dad's house playing checkers and listening to his stories about Mom. The tradition had started when Ruby was 5, just after Mom passed, and Dad needed something to live for. Tell me about Grandma Judith's apple turnovers again, she'd beg, and Dad would describe Mom's bakery with such detail you could almost smell the cinnamon. He'd tell her how Mom woke up at 4 a.m. every morning for 25 years to make fresh bread, how she knew every customer's name and their favorite pastry, how she'd give day-old cookies to kids who couldn't afford fresh ones. Your grandmother had flour in her hair more often than not, he'd say, smiling at the memory. I'd come home from my postal route and find her covered in powdered sugar, looking like an angel. And she was, Ruby. She was my angel. Mom had passed 3 years earlier from cancer, a brutal 6-month battle that took her from us piece by piece. She'd run Judith's Sweet Corner, a beloved local bakery, for 25 years. When she died, Dad kept her apron hanging in the kitchen, her reading glasses on the nightstand, her coffee mug in the same spot. The house became a shrine to their life together. Your mother's still here with us, he'd tell Ruby, tapping his chest. Right here, always. When you eat her recipes, when you help others like she did, when you choose kindness even when it's hard, that's Grandma Judith living on. But my siblings saw things differently. Patty, 4 years older and always Dad's princess, had expected to inherit Mom's bakery. She'd already had plans to sell it to a developer who wanted to turn it into a juice bar. When Mom left it to me instead, knowing I'd keep it running exactly as she had, while Patty would have sold it immediately, something broke between us. Unbelievable, Patty had said at the will reading, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. 20 years in real estate, I could have made that bakery worth 10 times what it is, and she leaves it to the elementary school teacher who can barely balance her own checkbook. Dennis, the baby of the family at 36, sided with Patty like he always did. He'd been living paycheck to paycheck as an insurance adjuster, always asking Dad for small loans he never repaid. They'd convinced themselves that Mom had manipulated Dad, that their 38-year marriage had been some kind of con game. Mom played favorites, Patty would say at every family gathering, usually after her second glass of wine. She turned Dad against us. Remember how she always made sure Melinda got the biggest piece of cake, the best Christmas presents? She groomed her to be the favorite. Dennis would nod along, adding his own poison to the mix. Remember how she always pushed Dad to update his will? Every few years, another revision. Classic manipulation. She was probably hiding money somewhere, playing the poor, baker while stashing cash away. The truth was simpler. Mom left me the bakery because I'd worked there every summer since I was 14. I knew every recipe, every regular customer, every supplier. I understood that the bakery wasn't about money, but about community. Patty saw dollar signs where Mom saw neighbors. Dennis saw an asset where Mom saw a legacy. Now Dad was gone too, and the vultures were circling before his body was even cold. The funeral was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. Wednesday night, we gathered at Dad's house for the wake. That's when things got ugly. Patty arrived in her Mercedes, designer black dress pristine, real estate agent smile plastered on her face. She walked through Dad's front door like she was already calculating square footage. Well, at least we can finally sell this dump, she announced, surveying Dad's modest home. Split everything 3 ways and move on. I already called my colleague at Century 21. She says the market's perfect right now. The house isn't being sold, I said quietly, setting down the casserole I'd brought from Mrs. Patterson next door. Dennis nearly choked on his beer. What do you mean not being sold? It's worth at least $300,000. Split 3 ways, that's $100,000 each. Dad updated his will last month. The silence was deafening. Patty's perfectly painted lips formed a thin line. Updated how, exactly? He left the house to Ruby, in trust until she's 18. The explosion was immediate. Patty's voice echoed through the house where we'd grown up, where Mom had bandaged our knees and Dad had taught us to ride bikes in the driveway. Of course he did. You probably manipulated him just like Mom manipulated everyone, using your kid to get sympathy. Poor single mother Melinda. Can't make ends meet on a teacher's salary. Better guilt Dad into leaving everything to precious little Ruby. Don't you dare bring Ruby into this, I warned, my hands shaking as I arranged the sympathy cards on Dad's coffee table. Why not? You've been using her since Mom died. Every Sunday, sending her over there to work on Dad, reminding him of Judith, making sure she mentions how hard things are, how expensive school supplies are getting, how the car keeps breaking down. You learned from the best, didn't you? Mom taught you well how to play the victim, how to make everyone feel sorry for poor, struggling single mom Melinda. Dennis jumped in, his face red with anger and alcohol. She's right, Melinda. We all know what you've been doing. Ruby just happens to need new shoes every time she visits Dad. Just happens to mention the field trip you can't afford. You've been coaching that kid since she could talk. That's not true, and you know it, I said, but my voice was drowned out by their accusations. Please, Patty scoffed. The bakery wasn't enough for you? Now you need the house, too. What's next? Dad's pension? His life insurance? How much did you and Mom plan to take? From this family? Uncle Walter tried to intervene from his wheelchair by the fireplace. Now, Patty, that's enough. Your father knew what he was doing. He was sharp as a tack until the end. Did he? Dennis jumped in, pointing his beer bottle at Walter. Or was he just a lonely old man being worked over by his granddaughter? Melinda probably coached her on exactly what to say. Tell Grandpa you miss Grandma. Tell Grandpa you want to be a baker like her. Tell Grandpa you're the only one who understands. That's when I noticed Ruby standing in the doorway. I hadn't heard her come downstairs. She was wearing her pajamas, the ones with little cupcakes on them that Dad had bought her last Christmas, and her face was pale. Mommy doesn't coach me, she said simply, her voice cutting through the ugly accusations. Grandpa Gordon loved telling me stories. He said Grandma Judith was the best person he ever knew. He said she saved him. Patty laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and cruel. Saved him? She trapped him. Pregnant at 24, of course he had to marry her. She played the long game perfectly. Trapped him with a baby, kept him under her thumb for 40 years, and taught Melinda here how to do the same thing with the next generation. You don't know what you're talking about, Uncle Walter said sharply. I was there, Patricia. I saw how they were together. You saw what she wanted you to see, Dennis insisted. Mom was smart. She knew how to play the loving wife in public. But we know the truth. We know she controlled everything, every decision, every penny. Dad couldn't buy a pack of gum without her permission. That's when Pastor Thomason arrived for the wake, and even he could feel the venom in the air. He stood in the doorway holding his Bible and a covered dish from his wife, looking between us with obvious discomfort. I seem to have come at a difficult time, he said carefully. Perfect timing, actually, Patty said, turning to him. Pastor, you knew our parents. Did my father seem like himself these last few months, or did he seem influenced, maybe confused? The pastor's face showed his dismay at being pulled into this battle. Your father seemed at peace. He spoke often of joining your mother. The wake ended with Patty and Dennis huddled in the corner, whispering about contesting the will, about Mom's psychological manipulation, about how they'd been cheated out of their rightful inheritance. They were already planning their legal strategy, while Dad's body waited at the funeral home, not even in the ground yet. The morning of the funeral, Ruby came into my room holding an envelope. The sunrise was just beginning to filter through the curtains, painting everything in soft gold, and she was already dressed in her black dress and shiny shoes. Grandpa gave me this last Sunday, she said, climbing onto my bed. He made me promise to read it at his funeral, but only if Aunt Patty and Uncle Dennis were being mean. About Grandma Judith. I studied the envelope carefully. Gordon's shaky handwriting spelled out the truth on the front, and it was sealed with actual wax, something I hadn't seen Dad do since he'd worked at the post office. He must have used his old letter seal, the one Mom had given him for their 10th anniversary. "Honey, what exactly did Grandpa tell you?" I asked, running my fingers through her dark hair. "He said sometimes people forget how to see love when they're too busy looking for money. He said this letter would help them remember. He made me practice reading it out loud 3 times so I wouldn't stumble on any words." "You practiced reading this?" Ruby nodded solemnly. "Every Sunday for the last month. He said it was important I read it clearly so everyone could hear. He said Grandma Judith would want the truth to come out if people were telling lies about her." I was torn completely. Part of me wanted to protect my father's funeral from more drama. The last thing I wanted was to turn his memorial service into a battlefield. But I also knew Dad never did anything without careful thought. If he gave Ruby this letter, if he made her practice reading it, if he sealed it with wax like an official document, then he had his reasons. "What else did he say, sweetheart?" Ruby pulled her knees up to her chest, remembering. "He said that love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, like how Grandma Judith would put extra cookies in his lunch without saying anything, or how she'd warm his side of the bed with a heating pad on cold nights before he got home. He said Aunt Patty and Uncle Dennis forgot the quiet love because they were listening for something else." "Did he seem sad when he gave you this?" "No," Ruby said, surprising me. "He seemed ready. He said he'd been waiting to tell the truth for 3 years but wanted to do it right. He said you'd know when the time was right, and I should follow your lead." At the funeral home, the tension was palpable from the moment we arrived. Patty and Dennis had positioned themselves in the front row like vultures, occasionally whispering to sympathetic relatives about their poor father and how he'd been deceived for years. They made sure everyone heard their theory that Mom had hidden money, that she'd secretly controlled everything, that the will was suspicious. "You have to wonder," Patty was telling Cousin Margaret loud enough for everyone to hear, "why Mom was so insistent about updating the will every few years. What was she hiding? What was she planning?" Dennis nodded along, adding to anyone who would listen. Dad never bought a new car, never took vacations, worked for 40 years. Where did all that money go? Mom's bakery barely broke even, supposedly. The math doesn't add up. During Pastor Thomason's eulogy, he spoke beautifully about Dad's dedication to his postal route, his love for his family, his devotion to the community. When he mentioned Mom and Dad's marriage, calling them an example of enduring love, Patty actually scoffed, the sound echoing in the funeral home. That's when she said it, that horrible whisper meant to be heard. He never loved her anyway. Dennis nodded, his voice carrying across the room. "She's just here for the money." Several relatives gasped. Mrs. Chen from Dad's postal route shook her head in disgust. Uncle Walter gripped his wheelchair arm so tight his knuckles went white. Even Mr. Holbrook, who had probably seen every kind of family drama in his 30 years as a funeral director, looked shocked. Pastor Thomason paused mid-sentence, clearly uncomfortable, his Bible trembling slightly in his hands. "Perhaps we should remember that we're here to honor Gordon," he said gently. "We are honoring him," Patty shot back, "by finally telling the truth about his sham of a marriage." The disrespect to both my parents' memory was unbearable. Here was Dad, lying in his casket 10 feet away, and his own children were tearing apart everything he'd held dear. I felt rage building in my chest, but then Ruby tugged on my hand. "Now, Mommy?" she whispered, her eyes bright with determination. I looked at my daughter's face, so much like her grandmother's, filled with the same quiet strength Judith had shown through every challenge. Dad had trusted Ruby with his truth, had prepared her for this moment. Who was I to stand in the way of his final wishes? "Now," I said, squeezing her hand once before letting go. Ruby stood up, and the envelope in her small hand seemed to glow with purpose. Ruby walked to the casket with the confidence of someone carrying out a sacred mission. She climbed onto the small platform the funeral director had placed there and turned to face everyone. The afternoon sun streaming through the stained glass windows created a halo effect around her small frame. My Grandpa Gordon asked me to read this if anyone said mean things about Grandma Judith, she announced, her voice clear and strong. She opened the envelope carefully and began to read. My dear family, if Ruby is reading this, then I'm gone, and some of you have forgotten the truth. So let me remind you. Patty and Dennis, you believe your mother trapped me, manipulated me, never loved me. You want to know the truth? Here it is. I was the one who was saved. When I met Judith, I was a drunk. Not a heavy drinker, a drunk. My father was a drunk, his father was a drunk, and I was heading down the same path at 23. I'd already lost 2 jobs, crashed 1 car, and spent more nights in jail than I care to remember. Your mother didn't trap me with pregnancy. She saved me with love. Patty's face went white. Dennis set down his phone, his mouth hanging open. Ruby continued, her voice never wavering. Yes, she was pregnant when we married. But what you don't know is that I begged her to marry me. She wanted to wait, wanted me to get sober first. She was prepared to raise Patty alone rather than tie herself to an alcoholic. She'd seen what alcohol had done to her own father. She said she'd rather be a single mother than watch another man destroy himself with drink. But I fought for her, for us. I went to AA meetings. I got a sponsor. I threw out every bottle, avoided every bar, changed every friend who enabled my drinking. I got sober for her, stayed sober for 42 years because of her. Not one drink, not even at your weddings, because I knew one sip would betray everything she'd given me by taking a chance on me. Uncle Walter was nodding, tears streaming down his weathered face. It's true, he said quietly. I drove him to those first AA meetings. Judith saved his life. Ruby kept reading, Dad's words filling the silent room. The money you're so concerned about? Your mother could have married Richard Brennan. Remember him? The developer who courted her before me? He had money, stability, a future. He sent her roses every day for a month, promised her a house with a white picket fence, vacations to Europe, everything a young woman dreams of. She chose a postal worker instead, a recovering alcoholic with shaking hands and no prospects. She chose love. Every penny we saved, she earned through that bakery, working 16-hour days while raising you 3, while supporting my recovery, while being the backbone I never deserved. She never threw my past in my face, never made me feel less than, never once complained about the life she could have had. When friends asked why she chose me, she'd say, "You don't know Gordon like I do. You don't see the man he's becoming." Patty had started crying, mascara running in black rivers down her cheeks. Ruby's voice grew stronger. When she was dying, when the cancer had spread everywhere and the morphine could barely touch the pain, she held my hand and said, "Gordon, you were worth it. Every hard day was worth it. You became the man I always knew you could be." Those were her words while cancer ate her alive. Not about money or property or things, about me, about us, about the life we built from ashes. The bakery went to Melinda because she's the only one who understood what it meant to your mother. Not money, but community, connection, love baked into every pastry. She watched her mother give away hundreds of loaves to families who couldn't pay. She understood that profit was never the point. The house goes to Ruby because she's the only one who still sees your mother's spirit in these walls instead of dollar signs. Dennis had slumped forward, his head in his hands. The entire funeral home was silent except for quiet sobbing from multiple relatives. Ruby turned the page and continued, "Patty, you forgot the woman who stayed up all night when you had scarlet fever at age 7, singing lullabies until her voice gave out, sponging your fever every 20 minutes. The doctors said she saved your life by refusing to let that fever spike. Dennis, you forgot the mother who worked 3 jobs to pay. For your college, when my postal salary couldn't cover it. She'd bake all night, work the bakery all day, then clean offices in the evening. She hid it from you because she didn't want you to feel guilty about getting an education. You both forgot the woman who loved you more than life itself because you're blinded by greed I never knew existed in my children. Your mother didn't manipulate me. She saved my soul." The silence was deafening. Ruby carefully folded the letter and walked back to me, her small hand finding mine again. I watched my sister's face crumble, 42 years of misplaced anger dissolving into recognition. She didn't collapse from shame about the inheritance. She collapsed from the weight of realizing she'd spent 3 years despising the mother who'd given everything for her. Dennis stood frozen, tears streaming down his face, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Uncle Walter was openly weeping, and even Pastor Thomason had to pause to compose himself before continuing the service. Mrs. Chen clutched her purse, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. The entire funeral home had just witnessed the truth about Gordon and Judith Crane's love story, and it was nothing like the bitter narrative my siblings had created. After the burial, as people slowly dispersed, Patty found me by Mom's grave. Dad had been laid to rest beside her, of course, their headstones matching just like they'd planned 30 years ago. The fresh earth over Dad's grave was covered with flowers, but someone had placed new roses on Mom's stone too, pink ones, her favorite. "The scarlet fever," Patty whispered, kneeling down despite her expensive dress. I'd forgotten completely. She stayed up for 3 days straight. The doctor said she saved my life by catching the symptoms early. She sang, "You Are My Sunshine" over and over until her voice was completely gone, but she kept humming it anyway. "She loved you, Patty. She loved all of us." "I know," she said, touching Mom's headstone with trembling fingers. "I think I always knew. When she left me out of the bakery, I felt so rejected. I turned that hurt into hate because it was easier than admitting I'd never understood what really mattered to her. The bakery was never about money. It was about feeding people, nurturing them, being part of their lives." Dennis joined us, holding a photo from his wallet that looked worn from years of handling. It was Mom at his college graduation, her face glowing with pride despite the exhaustion visible in her eyes. "She worked at the bakery, then cleaned offices at night, then did the farmer's market on weekends," he said quietly. "I told my friends she was just a baker. I was embarrassed by her flour-covered aprons and her broken English with the suppliers. God, what kind of son was I?" "You were young," I said gently. "We all were." "No," Dennis shook his head. "I was selfish. Even after college, when I got my insurance job, I never offered to help with the bakery, never offered to pay back what she'd spent on my education. I just assumed that's what parents did, never thinking about what it cost her." Ruby looked up at all of us, still holding the letter. "Grandpa said Grandma Judith wouldn't want you to be sad. He said she forgave everything before it even happened. That's what love does." Patty stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. "I need to tell you something, Melinda. Last year, I ran into Richard Brennan at a conference. He's a millionaire now, owns half the commercial real estate downtown. He asked about Mom, said she was the one who got away. He told me he'd proposed to her 3 times before she met Dad. 3 times. She turned down guaranteed wealth and security for a man struggling with addiction who might relapse any day." "And he never did relapse," Uncle Walter said, rolling his wheelchair closer. 42 years sober. He gave credit to Judith every single day, said she was his guardian angel." We stood there, 3 adult children finally understanding our mother's true inheritance, not money or property, but the example of unconditional love. Dad's letter hadn't just revealed the truth about their marriage. It had revealed the truth about who we'd chosen to become in our grief. The bakery still runs, now with Patty's help on weekends and Dennis managing the books for free. We renamed it Judith and Gordon's and hung their wedding photo by the register, the one where Mom has flour in her hair and Dad's looking at her like she hung the moon. Ruby helps me on Sundays, learning recipes that Mom never wrote down, but somehow Dad remembered perfectly and taught her before he died. She knows how to make the apple turnovers exactly right now, with just the hint of cardamom that made them special. Sometimes, love looks like sacrifice. Sometimes it looks like choosing someone not for what they have, but for who they are. And sometimes it takes an 8-year-old with an envelope to remind us that the greatest inheritance isn't measured in dollars, but in the memories of those who loved us despite our flaws. Dad was right. He's with her now. And somewhere, I know they're both smiling, finally understanding that love isn't about perfect families. It's about imperfect people choosing to love anyway, just like they did for 42 beautiful, difficult, worthwhile years. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below about a moment when you witnessed true love in your own family. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful real-life stories that remind us what really matters in this world.